Our analysts are here, so we can now start. No. Thank you all for your patience. Democracy is a strange and wonderful beast at times. It's my privilege to welcome the Department of National Defense here for our study on contaminated sites. We have with us Brigadier General Colleen Forestier, Peter Hammerschmidt, Assistant Deputy Minister, Infrastructure and Environment, Salim Sattar, Director General, Environment and Sustainable Management, and Major General Eric Simino, Deputy Commander, Military Personnel Command. Thank you all for joining us, and I understand that General Simino and Mr. Hammerschmidt are going to split the opening 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I'll start. Monsieur le Président et membres.
Mr. Chair and members of the committees, thank you for the opportunity to speak to the Department of National Defense's approach to managing contaminated sites. I'm happy to be here today on Anishinaabe territory. Major General Simino and I will be splitting our time for opening remarks. So I'm here today in my capacity as Senior Designated Official for Real Property Management at National Defense, and I'm joined by Mr. Salim Sattar, Director General, Environment and Sustainable Management. I'll provide you with a short overview of the framework under which our Contaminated Sites program operates, and then provide results of our ongoing efforts to clean up contaminated sites on our military bases.
Defense follows the Treasury Board directive on the management of real property, which requires custodian departments to follow standards and guidelines endorsed by the Canadian Council for Ministers of the Environment, to prioritize remediation risk or risk management activities on sites that pose the highest risk to human health and the environment, and to certify annually that the information submitted to the Federal Contaminated Sites Inventory is complete and accurate. National Defense has a total of 1,947 sites listed in the inventory, of which 1,201 are closed, and of which 627 are classified as active sites. These are sites where additional assessment, remediation, or monitoring activities are required. To carry out this work, National Defense relies on funding from the Federal Contaminated Sites Action Plan, or FCSAP. FCSAP is a cost-shared program that funds efforts to reduce the risks that these sites pose to human health and the environment. DND has been a partner in FCSAP since its inception in 2005. It has so far received close to $1.2 billion in funding, and we consistently spend over 90% of our available budget year over year. FCSAP is an enormously valuable program to us. Defense projects that have benefited from FCSAP include the Distant Early Warning Line Cleanup Project, which was completed in 2014 and at $575 million was the most significant environmental project by the Canadian government at that time. Another example is the Goose Bay Remediation Project in Labrador, which received $143 million from FCSAP and was completed in 2020. Over the last 4 years, Defense has spent nearly $273 million managing contaminated sites, and we have closed over 250 sites with this funding. This year, we are on track to spend another $65 million and close a further 50 sites. In recent years, we have placed special emphasis on sites with poly and perfluoroalkylated substances, or PFAS. Although PFAS are found in thousands of commercial and household products, its use in firefighting foams has led to PFAS impacts on military installations, as well as off-base. This is not unique to Canada, nor is it unique to DND. Many countries and allies are faced with this challenge, and it will continue to occupy more of our focus going forward. Le ministère de la Défense nationale reconnaît que
the Department of National Defense recognizes that past practices have left a legacy of contamination at military bases and other sites where the Canadian Armed Forces have trained or operated. We are committed to responsibly managing the effects of our operational legacy and doing our part to safeguard the health of Canadians. Thank you, Chair. I look forward to your questions, and I will provide the remainder of the time to Major General Simino.
General Simino, there seems to be an inequality of the split here, so you have about a minute left.
I will make best use of it, Mr. President, Mr. Chair. Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Chair, thank you for inviting us to appear before the committee today. We truly believe in the importance of the work underway and appreciate the opportunity to contribute to it. As was said, my name is Major General Eric Simino, Deputy Commander of Military Personnel Command, and with me is Dr. Brigadier General Colleen Forestier from our health services. As you know, the Canadian Armed Forces are often deployed overseas and operate in austere and high-risk areas. We therefore take risk analysis very seriously to provide our members with the best possible protections. This includes the responsibility of commanders at all levels to comply with all relevant regulations and policies, including Health Canada standards and guidelines, as well as the use of all available methods to protect our personnel.
perspective, this is achieved through the Canadian Forces Health Services that operate 33 clinics and subclinics throughout Canada, in addition to 2 in Europe and some at sea, where our Canadian Armed Forces are tasked to serve. Our health system also holds comprehensive records of our members' health, including any potential risk and exposure to any hazards. It provides clinical assessment and treatment, which allows us to provide copies of this information directly to our members and to Veterans Affairs Canada. We follow very closely progress made in science and learn from them, but we cannot do this alone. We collaborate with Veterans Affairs Canada, the Canadian Institute Military Veterans Health Research, Statistic Canada, amongst others, to conduct multi-year population-level comparison of CAF members' health. This allows us to identify potential hazards, mitigate the risk, and provide the highest level of support for any CAF members in the course of their service. The health and well-being of our members is our priority, and we are committed to the highest standards of care for those who serve Canada. Monsieur le Président, je vous retourne la parole. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I give you back the floor.
6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for having me back. And thank you to our witnesses, and thank you for those who are serving, and I do appreciate your service to our country. I have a few questions, quite a few questions, and I'm not sure we're going to be able to cover all of them. But Mr. Hammerschmidt, you mentioned about legacy. And I think this is an important question that I have. My concern that I will bring to this table is there's a base that's been in operation for, say, 60 years, okay? And there's been a contaminated site that's been on the base and maybe not identified because we've not really addressed this until recent years. And that site's been built over. How do you identify built over contaminated sites? How do you identify sites that, you know, that have been in the past that are not on your list? What happens with that kind of scenario?
Thank you for the question. And I think this was gone over a little bit in the previous session with witnesses from TBS and Health Canada. But in terms of the process, we do identify sites by following the standard process that's been endorsed by the Canadian Council for Ministers of the Environment. And so part of that process is, of course, doing the historical review of all the information that we have within our repositories. And so that is kind of step one, and that is usually the kind of most, I guess, valuable way in which we can identify the potential for contamination on sites on some of our bases.
And so, thank you. That's very important for us to know. Now, my question is, we've identified the sites, but what about the people that have worked on those sites? How do we link that to something that's, like I said, maybe been paved over or moved around? We have a veteran. I'm representing Veterans Affairs. We have someone that's a veteran comes and says, I am suffering because I worked with toxins or contaminated, and it's no longer identified on in an existing base. How do we address that to actually be able to help that veteran with a claim and identify the source of their medical condition.
Thank you for the question. I think, again, the historical information that we have on any given base would be probably the first place to start, and to be able to try to make a connection between potential contamination and the particular health circumstances of an individual. That's probably more in the kind of health and safety space than a contaminated site space, although of course there could be linkages to a potential contaminated site. But there would be work that we would need to do across various lines in our department, so from the contamination side to make connections to the health and safety side and the medical side to be able to identify if there was any potential linkage there. But I think that's kind of outside of my area of expertise.
Okay, so my main concern is that we're able to link people that maybe have health conditions to existing or to previous sites that may no longer be there, and to be able to help them validate their claims. And I think that's something that's important that we should be looking at. We talked about health services, and so my question is going to be, who is? We talked about custodians. Who is the custodian of a wing or a base or a unit that says, okay, it's my responsibility? And then the second question is, who's the expertise to identify what's a contaminated site in the military or on a base?
Thank you for the question. So with regards to the custodian of the base or wing, from a health services perspective, we provide all the guidance we can and professional expertise in the area of occupational environmental health hazards. And that information and guidance is provided to the base and wing commanders, who have the overall responsibility for the health and safety of those CAF and D&D employees on their base. So I guess that's sort of twofold to your question, which is the base commanders have the overall custodianship of that health and safety of the members on their base and wing. Health Services provides the occupational and environmental health expertise on health hazards and provides that guidance and risk mitigation advice, as well as the health care to CAF members serving on that base.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate just a little bit here.
You only got 20 seconds to do so.
Oh, okay. Oh, I'll be back. Okay, I'll save that question for a later round. Thank you.
Excellent choice. Mr. Collins, 6 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our witnesses today. The minister's been very clear that a number of our properties will be transferred to housing providers to assist with affordable housing. And I'm wondering what process we undertake prior to those transfers to ensure that because residential requirements as it relates to contaminants, it's a pretty high bar in different provinces, and I'm sure all the regulations are different. I'm just wondering what process you go through to ensure that those properties do meet regulations provincially. I'm assuming we're using provincial regulations. That is one of my questions. I'm wondering what process you undertake when you're going through the decontamination process. And then I have another question supplemental to that. You mentioned that 1,200 sites have been closed over the years. Environmental regulations are constantly changing, and I'm wondering how we retrospectively go back and investigate some of those properties that might have been decontaminated in the early days, 1990s, early 2000s, when the environmental regulations may not have been as strict as they are today.
Great questions. Thank you very much. So just on I guess maybe the latter question first, I think you're right. Environmental regulations do evolve over time. We have a really good sense of kind of what are the contaminants that would be in any closed sites. They're closed for a reason. They're closed because they went through a process, and that process would have identified the type of contamination that resides at those particular sites. And so with any kind of major evolution of an environmental regulation, we would then have the ability to know what we're looking for in terms of those closed sites and assess whether or not we need to reassess that site and reopen it and treat it as required. In terms of the process around divestment, it's a divestment process, and this is actually a very kind of formulaic process for divestment for custodians in the Government of Canada when we want to divest of surplus properties. And part of that process, I think it's point number 3, but I could be wrong, is looking at the question of contamination, assessing whether or not there's contamination on the site, and then undertaking any necessary remediation to ensure that site can be used down the line.
From a transparency perspective, there's a lot of information online that members of the public can access via the government's website. I'm wondering, in those instances where there is contamination that's gravitated off-site, becomes then a liability issue for the government, right? And certainly those in the bureaucracy have a fiduciary responsibility to limit the cost to the government, but we also have an obligation to be transparent and let the community know that this has happened and to what extent. Can you talk about how we wrestle internally with our policies as it relates to limiting liability, but ensuring that in communities where residential properties or commercial industrial properties have now located just outside the fence line of these legacy properties, how we're transparent with our neighbors and ensuring that they have all the information that they need to know to keep either their employees safe or their families safe?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, transparency is very important to us. We are committed to being transparent, and particularly about these kind of issues, because of course they have the potential to impact Canadians. And so we've tried to lean forward in that space. So, for example, in 2019, we changed some of our policies to ensure that there are now protocols in place to ensure that we engage external stakeholders, like landowners with adjacent properties or communities that might be impacted by off-site migration of dangerous substances. We changed our policy to ensure that there's protocols in place that we engage those stakeholders immediately, both in the instances of actual off-site migration of substances, but the potential off-site migration as well. And so, for example, we did this precisely in the context of PFAS off-site migration, in the context of Saguenay, in the context of North Bay, in the context of Mountain View by Trenton.
Mr. Chair, how much time do I have?
You've got a little over a minute.
Perfect. Very quickly, in terms of when the custodian changes and it's no longer the government and contamination is found on a property, what obligations do we have with the new custodian to play a part in the cleanup of that property?
Thank you for the question. I think the government's been fairly clear in its commitment to addressing those types of situations. So it's got the Federal Contaminated Sites Action Plan program, but that's for legacy government properties. For those properties that exist off of government, or they're not owned by government, there is something called the Shared Responsibility Framework that's in place, and this is a vehicle through which the government can contribute to the addressing of contaminated sites when there was federal activities that led to that contamination. So, for example, Defence has at the present time 3 shared responsibility framework agreements in place. We're negotiating a 4th in order to do exactly that, to be able to contribute to the cleanup of contamination off federal property.
Dean. Wonderful to see you again. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Always a pleasure to see you. Thank you to the witnesses for being here. I'd like to begin with a question on the identification of sites. We heard from the custodians of sites last week who didn't have access to registers or listing all of the products, all of the chemical products that were used in the past, sometimes several years after they've actually been used. A lot of these products are contaminants. So what do you do to alert people and contact people when you know that there is a contaminant present? What's the process Are there any lists that you're provided with us on a regular basis? Do you get information from the Department of Defense on sites that are potentially contaminated?
So, Mr. Chair, I'll kind of return to the process that we put into place for all contaminated sites. And so there is a very detailed and kind of deliberate way that we move through this. We first identify potential sites, and we can do that based on our own knowledge, but we can do that based on concerns raised from elsewhere. We will then collect and review as much documentation as we possibly can to be able to identify what kind of activities took place at that site, which could, of course, then inform the type of contamination that could potentially be there. We look also not just at the contaminants, but also at the pathways and the receptors. So in other words, the contamination plus the way in which that contamination could potentially impact human health and the environment. We'll then do initial testing. That'll give us a good characterization of what is on the site. And then that leads us to the point at which we can classify a site. And as you may have heard during the previous session, that classification is very important for the federal contaminated sites inventory. The classification prioritizes that particular site in the inventory and allows you to make informed decisions about how to allocate resources against it. And with that classification, we'll again have a really good sense of how important it is, because it really captures the risk to humans and the environment. Then that'll inform how we go about informing potential stakeholders, employees, or anyone that could be potentially impacted by the contamination.
Merci beaucoup. Et justement, votre réponse m'amène à une question.
Thank you. That leads me to another question. You said that you can identify sources in the case of Bagotville and Saguenay. We know that researchers from the University of Montreal that conducted its own research, does the Department of Defense was aware of the possibility of contamination in Bagotville before the researchers did their work?
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for your question.
When those researchers did that work, but
November 2023.
Donc, je pense que oui, on savait avant ça.
I think we did know about it before then. Bagotville.
The site of airfields, but also a firefighter training area. And here I'm talking about PFAS in particular. PFAS is a contaminant that is found in firefighting foam. And as a result of that, we have identified PFAS contaminated sites across the country, including in Bagotville. And so we have been, I think, since 2010, regularly testing for PFAS across all of our sites. And I don't know exactly when we found it. I might invite Mr. Satar if he knows the exact date, but we would have identified it before 2022.
Parfait, merci. Et justement,
Thank you. Based on your answer, I'd like to hear what you have to say about the threshold that causes you to alert the population that are around the contaminated sites. And I'm talking about areas that are outside of the base. How do you trigger some type of response? Because sometimes people are taken by surprise. This was a case in Saguenay when we came to potential contamination.
I think, again, it'll be, if we know that something has migrated, and we do regular testing to determine if this has been the case. If we know something's migrated, that we will immediately alert local stakeholders. We'll also do the same thing if we think there is potential. So again, as we assess a site, we're looking at three things: the contaminant, the pathways, and the receptors. And if the pathways and the receptors suggest that there is a risk of an off-site migration, then we will, even if it hasn't happened yet, we will engage local stakeholders.
alors, est-ce que je dois comprendre que dans le cas de Ville-Saguenay, comme
So in the case of Saguenay, do you think that the city of Saguenay was aware of potential contaminant and also of the contaminations just outside of Bagotville?
I'm not sure exactly of the history of the file and when exactly Saguenay became aware and how so, but I know that we have been working very closely and very positively with the City of Saguenay to engage with them on addressing the PFAS that is now leached into their water supply. We are working with them through one of these shared responsibility framework agreements that I mentioned earlier, with a $15.5 million investment in a temporary water treatment solution, and are working with them as well on a long-term permanent solution for that water supply.
In 6 minutes, Ms. Madison.
Thank you to everyone for appearing today. So I think I want to take on where take back from where Mr. Tolmie had ended off. So again, last week, Health Canada, Environment Canada, Treasury Board came before us. They were very clear about the stewardship or the custodianship, which we've talked about. And I understand that you've now said so in on a base or wing, it's those commanders are ultimately responsible. However, what level of training does the Canadian Armed Forces or DND provide those custodians with in terms of the appropriate health, public health expertise in order to be those full custodians?
Thank you for the question. I'll leave the question of the training on the medical side to my colleague here, but just in terms of on the environmental side, so first in terms of the contaminated sites themselves, that capacity, that expertise, we go out to the private sector when we assess the contamination on sites, because that capacity is resident in the private sector more so than in the government.
Right.
However,
sorry, but that wasn't the question. I wanted to know specifically about those people who are charged at the end of the day. How are they supposed to understand exactly what information they're receiving to make the decisions that they need to make?
On the bases and wings, the individuals that are there as environmental officers, and again, I can't speak for the medical folks, but environmental officers are trained in environmental sciences and have that background and expertise to be able to speak to these issues.
Okay. But, so for those environmental officers being responsible, my understanding is that when Canadian Forces Real Property Operations was centralized, those environmental officers were left out of the day-to-day operations of bases, that they were not part of the chain of command. So can you confirm that that's the case, and then comment on whether that's helpful to have those experts that you're talking about that have the expertise to actually be outside of that chain of command, not reporting to the ADM in charge of this, for example?
Thank you for the question. I'll actually ask Mr. Sitar to respond.
So thank you for that question, because you're correct. At centralization, the environmental officer community, I don't want to say stayed behind, but they stayed with the Army, the Navy, the Air Force. And it makes sense because they also have environmental impacts and environmental risks from their operations. So those environmental officers are there to watch out for the units and the companies and the exercises and the training operations that happen on those bases. But we have an agreement with all of those environmental officers to support ADMIE, the infrastructure custodian. So they support us as they support all of the lodgers on the bases with environmental services and advice. So I rely on that community for their knowledge and their training, and they help us identify those risks and manage environmental risk.
So they're providing expertise to both at the same time, both centrally and to base commanders?
Correct.
Even though they were centralized out of the day-to-day. Like, they don't see the day-to-day operations. So how are they a part of that reporting to the base commanders as well?
They're not part of the day-to-day. They don't belong to the RP Ops group. They don't belong to the infrastructure chain of command, but they work very closely with. So they are sometimes co-located, or they attend regularly the briefings and the training and the collaboration with RP Ops. So there is close collaboration at the base level, so the base NVO knows what's going on at the base and can intervene on environmental risk.
Okay. When a contaminated site is identified, what steps are taken to communicate the information to Canadian Armed Forces members, their families, the public servants that work or live on the site. What legal responsibilities exist in the contaminated site plan or other legislations to ensure that the personnel is able to make an informed decision? I know that a lot of it's public, however, what's that plan look like? What does that communications plan look like exactly?
Thank you for the question. It'll of course depend on the assessment of the site, what it finds vis-a-vis the contaminant, the pathways, and the receptors. And so, if there is determined to be a significant risk, then steps will be taken to ensure that any adjacent or potentially affected stakeholders would be engaged. If there is a contaminant that can move off the site, whether it's by air, whether it's by water, or soil, then there will be the appropriate measures taken to ensure that anyone who could be affected will be engaged.
Okay. I'm gonna leave it. Look at that. Maybe bank it if I
You can
could.
bank it, yeah.
Sweet. Thanks.
Okay, Ms. Gallant, 5 minutes.
Thank you. Since Base Petawawa's firefighting training area was confirmed to be PFAS contaminated, can you tell us what the short-term and long-term effects of PFAS on the personnel stationed on Base Petawawa would be? And that's for Brigadier General Forestier.
Thank you for the question. So with regards to PFAS specifically, I'm not a complete expert in PFAS, but I am aware of the fact that PFAS is associated with certain specific conditions in over time. I don't have a list of them specifically with me right now.
Okay. Can you confirm that spores from anthrax can persist in the soil for decades, and viable spores have been found in 200-year-old bones and are resistant to radiation? Dr. Forestier?
I can't answer that question,
Pardon me?
Madam. I'm sorry, I don't have expertise in that particular area.
Okay, so that's okay. So after Canada, and this goes to anyone, after Canada turned Grosse Ile near Quebec into a bioweapons lab during World War II, specifically for the development of anthrax and the development of anthrax cluster bombs, do you know how the anthrax was disposed of? Is there somewhere where there would be a record of it?
Yes, surely there will be a record of it, and we could dig up those records and provide that information.
Could Canadians independently look up that record, find out for ourselves?
I'll ask Mr. Sitar here to see if he knows if it's on the inventory.
So we do have a warfare agent disposal inventory. It is not publicly available. It can be made available, of course. In the federal contaminated site inventory, we have a list of 13 sites, all at Suffield, where there's a record of some biological and chemical agents that had been used. But other than that, we're not tracking an inventory per se.
The mustard gas and sarin, VX?
I don't know the specific agents, but we just know that there was a lot of research and testing done at that site over the many years.
What were the findings of the Chrétien Martin Liberals announced $10 million in funding for a scavenger hunt for chemical munitions that were lost or disposed of after World War II?
Sorry, I'm unable to answer that question.
So that's ancient history then? You don't know what that scavenger hunt would have turned up back in those days? And would there be a record of it? And how would we find those records?
I think we just have to try to find them in our archives and provide them.
Okay, so what, if anything, do you know about the mustard gas munitions dumped in the Baltic Sea after World War II? Are they still injuring fishermen out there?
Again, I'm sorry. I don't have the specifics on that.
Well, if it's our munitions, yes.
Well, if it's our munitions is a big
Yeah,
question.
and it would have been would not have asked the question. So Garrison Petawawa is just south of Chalk River Laboratories, which does nuclear research. Are there records to identify where munitions and chemicals used for testing were buried on ACL property, which is Crown land also?
So that I can provide some information on. We have tracked that. There is a small quantity of some obsolete chemical agent, as well as some arsenic, I believe, that has been encased in an 8 cubic meter concrete block. It was buried in AECL at a site that was dedicated to the management of wastes and low-level radioactive waste. Subsequently, that we had worked with AECL, NDDN and AECL worked together to dig that up and then properly dispose of it.
So it has been dug up and properly disposed of?
It has been,
All right,
yes.
so they're not going to come across that when they ameliorate the land?
No.
Are you aware of the sarin and the VX that were stored at Suffield? You said various agents, but do you know about those specific agents?
I don't know the list of specific agents that are dealt with at Suffield. Suffield is of course, our Center for Defense Against Biological and Chemical Weapons, but I don't know exactly what they have in inventory there or what's on site.
Okay, Ms. Lalonde, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup d'être ici aujourd'hui.
Thank you for coming here today.
We've been looking at different types of contaminant found on D&D sites, as you mentioned, including the TCE and PFAS. Can you give the committee an overview of the different types of contaminants that the Federal Contamination Site Inventory monitors? And could you also give an overview of the different ways they affect human health, please?
I can speak to the contaminants, or at least some of them that we monitor, but I would turn over to, in terms of impacts on human health. I think, the defense, of course, has locations across the country. We've been in operation for a very long period of time. And defense is a business that requires use of a number of different types of chemicals. So things like TCE, these are used to degrease metal parts. So as you can imagine, in the context of military vehicle assembly, there's TCE used, there's benzene, arsenic is another common substance that is used. There are lots of contaminated sites as well with petrochemicals, hydrocarbons. And then increasingly what we're seeing recently is more and more PFAS as a result of the use of firefighting foams. I'd say those are kind of the most common elements that we discover on contaminated sites.
I just would like to know what's the impact, and I don't, just in the day-to-day reality of anyone who would have been exposed, what would we have seen or a person would have feel?
So thank you for the question. I think it's important to identify that being close to a hazard doesn't necessarily constitute an exposure, and being exposed does not necessarily constitute having any ill health effects, even if it's a known hazard. So a lot of the challenge becomes identifying what that particular hazard is, what the risk of that individual or group of individuals' exposure looks like, and what that potential health effect is depending on the length of time or the amount of exposure over time. And even two people in the same space may have two very different types of exposure. So with regards to what type of health effects, it'll be highly dependent on what type. Is it a chemical, a physical, a biological, a radiological hazard? And it will depend on the specific item, the specific chemical or whatever it is, as well as the amount of exposure that individual had. And so, sometimes in rare cases, there might be an acute health effect where the individual feels ill or unwell or has an effect immediately. And certainly that would be handled in that particular acute situation. In other situations, it may be a much longer timeline. As we know, cigarettes and lung cancer is a good example. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is it's highly dependent, highly variable, And the main goal is to identify the exposure, identify the individuals who may have been exposed, and then to appropriately risk mitigate and monitor as required if that is that particular exposure is of concern.
Thank you very much for this. And maybe to end my questions, how has DND and the CAF collaborate with other government departments and other level of government and stakeholders to deal with these contaminated sites? And we heard from Treasury boards, we've heard from health and also climate change and the environment. How does that all factor? You were supposed to come first, so I just would like to have your perspective on that close collaboration, please.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, it is a very close collaboration. It's a relatively tight-knit community. We, as a custodian department, along with our other custodian colleague departments, we depend quite heavily on a lot of the expertise that you would have had before you last week, represented by Health Canada and other expert departments. We work, all of those departments, the experts as well as the custodian departments, they work together to do the governance for the FICSAP program. So there's a very active ongoing kind of discussion around how to best manage that program. We also do, there's a lot of kind of lessons learned exchange between all of our custodial departments. I'd add as well, we work very closely with allies on this as well, because we are not the only militaries that are facing these problems. So we'd like to leverage lessons from our allies. In fact, if you look across the Five Eyes in particular, we've got very similar regimes in place. We all prioritize human health and the environment. We all lean forward on transparency and online inventories. We're all leaning into PFAS now because it's a growing problem for all of our countries. And so we work very closely with the Australians and the Americans in particular on PFAS. We sit on a number of technical groups.
We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you, Ms. Lalonde. 2.5 minutes, s'il vous plaît, Madame Norn.
2.5 minutes, Ms. Normandy. Thank you. I'd like to go back to that issue. I understand the information came out in November of 2022. I'd like to know two things. The first date when the municipal authorities or provincial authorities were advised of the risk of a contamination, and at that time, what was the highest rate registered in a water source outside of the Begafell site? Because we know that I think the researchers found 129 milligrams, but I would like to know if it'd be possible for you to provide us with this information. I'd also like to ask you, when during this process, when you identified this, when was this information transferred to the Ministry of Justice for possible compensation? Where are we in this process of compensation?
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for your question.
Specifics about the levels that were discovered, as well as when exactly we were in touch with the city of Saguenay. Unless Mr. Sitar has a specific information, we can provide that to you separately. In terms of the litigation, are you referring to Balcartier and Shannon?
En général,
in general terms, when, for example, when a site has been identified, when does the Department of Defense forward it to the Ministry of Justice or the legal offices? Is it done immediately, or does that take time?
I think, thank you for the question. I think we maintain an ongoing conversation with our justice colleagues that are in national defense. So they have a general awareness of the inventory, the defense inventory of contaminated sites. And we will engage them proactively if and as we see a potential for litigation around any contamination. So while they won't know the specifics of each and every single site in our inventory on a regular basis, we do have that kind of open conversation with them and engage them when we know that there's something that could result in some litigation of some sort.
merci.
2.5 minutes, Ms. Masson, plus a couple of seconds.
Oh, your generosity, sir. Thank you. So we'll be hearing from Veterans Affairs folks shortly about the responsibility for them to provide compensation for CAF members that got sick from exposure during their service. But we'll be hearing from a lot of people, public servants living on military bases that have become sick through exposure. Can you tell this committee what responsibility the Department of National Defense has to take care of their employees to not only avoid exposure to contaminants, but to provide compensation for illness caused by exposure?
Mr. Chair, I'll take this one. So once we know that there's a situation on one of our bases that we're the custodian, we document everything and we take appropriate mitigation actions in order to protect our population. If and in any regards, should someone, a CAF member, become sick for whatever reason, we always treat those members. We have our own health services that replicates what provinces have. So we have the whole spectrum, the whole jurisdiction to care for our personnel, and we do. So the situation that may be of interest is how, if those symptoms, if those medical situation reveal themselves after release of a CAF member from the forces. Since we documented everything, we know where our members have been posted and what. And if a site reveals itself, we will be able to match the two. We do communicate that information. Veterans Affairs colleagues, they always we have a hotline with them. They know exactly where our member was, and if they can, and that's a good question to ask them after us. But if they can link it to service, regardless of the cause, they would be inclined to provide, and they're very proactive in that domain.
And this remains the same for civilian. And I would like to actually also ask, so is there no proactive measures that are done? Say somebody works on a site and you already know that it's contaminated, whether they do or not show any sort of symptoms when they retire, that there is a possibility. Is there any proactive measure on that? But I was also asking about civilian employees.
So I'm not the expert on the civilian side. However, our wing and base health and safety committees, they represent the whole population on base to include the civilians. So when we learn about the situation on one of the bases, we always take the appropriate mitigation measures, which would also be of not interest, but they would guide the public service to adopt, I suppose, the same measures to protect their personnel.
Okay.
Mr. Tolmie, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. So Ms. Matheson tried to steal my thunder a little bit earlier on. She's okay, so I am going to circle back and ask the question again. You supply, and to become a base commander or a wing commander, that's no small feat. We have highly intelligent officers that are running bases. And so this is no discredit to their intelligence, but their expertise is in the training that they've received throughout their career. And now we're dealing with toxic chemicals that are on the base, and they need to learn how to identify that. So Brigadier General Forrester, you mentioned that you give them information to help them identify. My concern is can they overlook that? Is that something that is either overlooked, ignored? Maybe they've got budgetary restraints and they don't want to deal with the chemical issues, and instead of dealing with it right away, they want to push it off. How do we address this? How do you address my concerns that I have with these questions?
So once we have the advice from the medical experts, but I would add from the environmental officers as well that we discussed earlier, as well as health and safety advisors. That's what the wing and base committees are all about, is to share that information. A wing commander would never sit on information received. They most likely don't have all the resources or the knowledge, but they have to reach back to ADMIE or to the NDHQ matrix in order to enable them. So it's really important that we realize that they're not alone on their wing and bases, although they're the face of and they're the voice to the people. They always have the NDHQ backing and trying to enable them through plan of action, through frameworks, and through medical advice, through health and safety advice also.
So here's another question that I have. A wing commander comes in, they're there for 2 years. Then they move on, and they're for 2 years, and then they move on for 2 years. How do we know that there's follow-through, that the contaminated sites are being addressed, that it's not slipping through the cracks?
I'll take this one, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the question again. So, as you suggested in your opening comments for this second round, it's no small feat to become a wing and a base commander. The onboarding process is very thorough and very regimented. So this element, the health and safety and the medical, is a big portion of a handover between two commanders. This cannot fall between the cracks. Someone cannot blame ignorance on those issues because those files are documented, number one, and they're passed on to the next commander. But also, as I mentioned, there's the reach back. Those connection with NDHQ, with the mothership have occurred, and they will continue with the next commander to be implemented as required.
Thank you. And, sorry, Mr. Hammerschmidt, you wanted to piggyback
Yeah, I was
on
just
that.
going to kind of complement that answer, just to say, and Eric alluded to it, the institutional continuity is there at NDHQ, including my team, but other resources as well. And in terms of just general operations, our RP, a Real Property Operations Group, in all of their presence across the country, they do regular testing as we're required to do under the Canada Labour Code. For air quality, water quality at our sites. And so there is a kind of a continuity of practice that is going to be happening regardless of the changing of command at basis.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your answer. So last meeting we had, there were some concerns about chemicals that may not be on the Environmental Protection Act list that may be used by the military. How are we addressing that? And can you give me an answer? I'm sure you've watched the recordings and are prepared that we were going to ask that question for this meeting. There's weapons, chemicals that the military's used, and the EPA has their list, but are these being identified, inventoried, and added to this EPA list?
Thank you for the question. Yes, I mean, it's less, I guess, a contaminated sites issue than a health and safety issue, but nevertheless, we do maintain lists of agents, any toxic substances that we work with that could be harmful. And as an institution, we have responsibilities under the Canada Labour Code to ensure that all of those are well identified, they're well managed, and that there's processes and protocols for dealing with those chemicals, and as well as storing them. So there are processes in place that we follow on all of our bases across the country.
Thank you. Ms. Dolmy. Final question, Ms. Lapointe.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Hammerschmidt, you mentioned in your opening remarks that other allied countries are facing similar challenges. Can you tell this committee how have our allies responded to this issue, and are there lessons that we've learned from what they've been doing and or have done?
Thank you for the question. So yeah, there are similarities between our countries, and we have similar regimes in place at the end of the day. And so most of the allies that we work most closely with have similar programs to FICSAP that are centrally controlled programs that their defense departments draw on to be able to address contamination on defense-related sites. Because a lot of our allies, again, have similar types of contamination, we can draw lessons from how they deal with and remediate those contaminants. In terms of the way they prioritize contaminated sites, again, there's some great similarities there because they also prioritize the potential for impact on humans and the environment. And so very similar regime in terms of how they approach contaminants and the need to address those contaminants. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I think PFAS is one of these emerging contaminants that is just driving a lot of concern and a lot of work. And this is, this science is science, regardless of borders, and we can draw on a lot of that from our allies.
Run us through the process of removing the contaminants from sites, and I expect that there would be some factors that probably make some of the removals even more complicated. And I have a part B to that question, which is what measures do you take to minimize and mitigate the risk to our Canadian Armed Force members and to the surrounding communities if that's applicable?
I think, so every site is kind of different in its own way because of the nature of the contaminant, but also the nature of the site itself. So they'll all be site dependent, but in terms of typical remediation work, there's a lot of, so in a maritime environment, I was in CFB Esquimalt, in Esquimalt Harbor last week, and so I saw the results of a lot of the work that they've been doing. There, it's a dredging operation, so all the material on the bottom of the harbor is dredged up, and it's screened, and then cleaned, and then as if and as necessary, the cleaned up material is pushed back into the harbor. And over time, we've been able to make some really significant progress in Esquimalt Harbor by using that method. On land, there will also be screening of material, and soil is either disposed of off-site or it's cleaned and then returned to the site, depending, again, on the contaminant and the nature of the precise site.
How would you, how about the environmental impacts of these contaminants? How are they measured by the department? And what steps do you take, again, to minimize or to mitigate the risk to the environment?
So I think, again, in a remediation type of activity, we will remove, it can happen a few ways. You can remediate by dealing with the contaminant on the site. And I won't even try to get into any kind of scientific explanation of the process there, but you can deal with it on the site, or you can dispose of it. And then there's also risk mitigation activities to block off the site or to make the site somehow inaccessible, or other types of kind of risk mitigation activities that could be undertaken. I don't know if Mr. Satar has a few more examples, but there are multiple ways to deal with this.
There's two main tools that we use to assess risk. There's a human health risk assessment and there's an ecological risk assessment. So the ecological tool helps us identify impacts to flora and fauna. So we look at plants, we look at animals, we look at fish, and that ecological assessment helps us then design mitigation measures and solutions for contaminated sites.
To what degree can you involve communities in the work that you're doing?
Well, we can involve them from a kind of a contracting or economic perspective, in the sense that communities could be involved in the actual remediation work themselves. Again, they will be engaged if and as there's any potential for migration or any potential impact of contaminants to the local communities. And engage communities on the kind of views around the future potential use of those sites. Because at the end of the day, they live there and they need a voice in kind of how those sites could potentially be used once they're cleaned up.
And I think it bears repeating, we could recommend Sudbury as a terrific example of a remediation site. Before I let you go, the Department of Transport, when they're intending to acquire, say, airport lands or something such as, put a notice on everybody's title within a certain proximity to the intended site. Is there any such similar program with the military when there's an intention to acquire a site, that there's a notification to the proximate landowners that there will be a military base here? Because it's not just contamination, it is also a significant impact on the neighborhood.
That's a great question. I think I might only have a partial answer to that. In acquiring property, we have authorities, we can do some of that ourselves, but we also normally work with PSPC quite closely. The extent to which PSPC and Defense would be involved in explaining what the potential use of those properties, I think depends on what the potential use might be. But I can only assume that we do have processes in place to engage local stakeholders if there's going to be military activity there. We do that now in almost every context. So bases communicate regularly with local stakeholders around activities. When there's operations and training exercises, we communicate with Canadians. So in the context of a purchase of an acquisition of land for the purposes of military installation or activities, I imagine we would be communicating.
Yeah. Unfair question, but having said it's unfair, it's also significant in a number of contexts where the military is a huge presence in any community. So with that, I want to thank you on behalf of the committee. Very informative and helpful. I appreciate it that we're going to suspend. Mr. Pawlowski, you need to do your testing, so you can do it while we're suspended. With that, thank you. Stephen Harris, who is with us physically but not virtually, Senior Director, Strategic Planning and Oversight, Service Delivery Branch, Sean McDougall, Senior Director, Strategic Planning and Oversight by video conference, and Nathan Svensson, Acting Senior Director, Disability and Healthcare Policy, also by video conference. Thank you, gentlemen, for your presence here and your patience. Mr. Harris, you have 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members, for inviting Veterans Affairs Canada representatives here today to speak briefly about our role in supporting Canada's veterans. As noted, I'm Stephen Harris. I'm joined by my two colleagues, Sean McDougall and Nathan Svensson from Charlottetown. Tout d'abord, je me permets de dire que les personnes.
First of all, I must say that the brave individuals who serve in the armed forces deserve our greatest respect and admiration. Their work is difficult and demanding, often carried out under dangerous conditions. Our gratitude alone is not adequate. We also have the duty to ensure that Canadian veterans and their families receive the care and support they deserve. We have a collective responsibility administered by Veterans Affairs Canada to provide a full range of services that meet the needs of veterans and their families.
This mandate through the delivery of a variety of programs and services. Chief among them is the Disability Benefits Program, VAC's largest program. This program provides compensation for permanent disabilities arising from service and serves as a gateway to access other supports that help veterans deal with the impacts of these disabilities throughout their post-service lives. Under the Disability Benefits Program, applicants can apply for benefits for any medical condition that they feel was caused by their service. This commonly includes conditions like hearing loss, mental health issues, diseases such as cancer, respiratory issues, and other physical conditions. When considering exposures, VAC recognizes that Canadian Armed Forces members may have been exposed to environmental hazards during their service. It is important that I highlight for the committee that VAC provides benefits for the impact of the military service on a member. For example, the medical condition caused by the exposure, as opposed to the exposure itself. When veterans apply for disability benefits, they explain, to the best of their ability, how their current medical condition was caused by their service. The department confirms the medical diagnosis with a health professional and reviews each application, as well as the applicant's service and medical records, on a case-by-case basis to confirm that the applicant's condition is related to their service. For all types of conditions, the department considers both established and emerging research on the causes of the specific medical conditions. This research is essential in establishing a causal connection between the service experience and a medical condition. With respect to exposures, health professionals and researchers at VAC convert studies on exposures in particular geographic locations on particular Canadian Armed Forces occupations into a streamlined process that establishes a link between military service and certain conditions. In doing this, we alleviate some of the administrative burden veterans face when seeking benefits and services. So in order to improve our understanding of the long-term health effects and impacts on military service on veterans, VAC has ongoing collaboration, as you've just heard, with partners such as Department of National Defence, Statistics Canada, veteran stakeholders, and university-based researchers. Research is underway to examine cancer incidents among veterans by leveraging historical Canadian Armed Forces and Human Resources data and the Canadian Cancer Registry. This research covers an important period of several decades and will inform disability benefits decision-making for veterans and their families. The collection and assessment of data and new research on Canadian veteran population is essential in helping us to expand our understanding of links between military service, including exposures, and certain medical conditions. Finally, VAC is the current lead for a Five Eyes Veteran Research Committee working on military exposures, which has performed a review of military exposure data sources from across countries. It is our hope that through this continued collaboration, we will further improve our understanding of the impacts of exposures on military service. We look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Mr. Allison, 6 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your opening remarks, Mr. Harris. I guess when it comes to compensation, and I understand what you're saying, you look at a variety of things that are going on, and you understand what has gone on maybe before, and they make their case individually. So if support's provided, then how is it involved in terms? What kind of envelope does funding come out of? Is that in addition to what you have for back right now, or is it a different envelope? Is that something you've got to go back to the government for if there's more, we discover there's more issues, or one-time payments, those kinds of things?
At Veterans Affairs, we have a quasi-stat approach for funding. And so what that means is we are funded by the Canadian government to respond to and compensate veterans for as many veterans as come forward in a given year who qualify as eligible for our programs. So when we speak of the disability benefits program, whether 1, 10, or 10,000 veterans come forward in a given year to support or seek access to compensation for exposures, injuries, illness that they've suffered as part of their service, we will have that money from the Government of Canada. We have an estimate at the start of the year as to how many we think might come forward and how much money we might need. And through the process of things like supplementary estimates and others, we can go back and get more money if needed, if we're processing more applications than typical or we're seeing more applications than typical as well. So it's a funding envelope that is flexible to allow for us to compensate veterans who are deemed eligible for the program.
And so I'm guessing that as well in terms of, and you sort of alluded to your remarks, I just maybe like get you to expand a little bit in terms of understanding what's going on, like, you know, with veterans and the potential. So obviously, if it's been discovered or it's been talked about in the news, so you guys are going, you know, almost maybe have a matrix of things you sort of maybe expecting to come, maybe something that's required to have your services for.
So again, we've been doing disability benefits for veterans of wars and Canadian Armed Forces service for near a decade. Sorry, a century. Compensating those from First World War right through modern day service. We have, and we've been exposed to a range of issues over that period of time, and we built a model and a table of disabilities and supports that are in place to help those veterans who come forward seeking our assistance. We know approximately how many we might expect on a given year. That number has increased on a regular basis. It goes up by about 10% every year, and so we've seen about a 75% increase in applications to our programs since 2015, and that annually goes up by about 10%. In terms of who comes forward and what kinds of conditions they come forward to, that varies a little. You know, we may have, as I noted, increases in applications for mental health benefits. That's been significant over the last number of years. We still deal with a number of physical illnesses or injuries. As a result of that, exposures are something that as well we would be looking at and seeing whether or not there's increases in those areas and what we can do to help streamline the process for veterans and for our own assessors to make sure that those decision-making or those decisions can be made as quickly as possible.
Time's done.
Okay.
Just over 2 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. Question is, what is that hard number? You said it increases 10% roughly per year. What's the hard number of veterans that are in the program at the moment?
So I don't think I have that number exactly with me. Sean, do you have if I might just ask my colleague here who might have the exact number of people in the disability benefits program.
I don't have the specific number of recipients, Stephen, but last year we received around 80,000 applications.
Wow. Okay, and then do we have a geographic distribution of that number from BC to the?
We do have a list of clients who would have submitted applications or people who are established within the Veterans Affairs program by province. We can certainly share that with the committee if that's okay, Mr. Chair.
So the healthcare services provided locally, and then does that build back to Veterans Affairs?
Essentially, you know, there are differences existing where there are service relationships to injuries. Veterans Affairs pays for a number of medical services that would be supporting veterans in that case. If you think of something like a mental health benefit that somebody might go and seek counseling from a psychiatrist or something, Veterans Affairs would pay for that cost. There are also costs that are paid for as part of regular Canadian healthcare system.
So in specific relation to exposure to contaminated sites, what would we see as proportion of claimants that are looking for healthcare services as a result of being exposed to contaminated substances versus, say, healthcare services, or sorry, mental health services?
As compared to mental health services, I'd have to go back and look at that number.
80,000 people in the program. How many are we thinking about are related to contamination?
Exposure claims are likely to be far smaller. You know, we had a large number of veterans coming out of Afghanistan who have come forward, and sought mental health benefits. That's very clear. Exposure and cancers related to military service are much more rare that we see in terms of applications in the system. As noted, we see applications for conditions. So the condition may be cancer rather than the actual cause of exposure. So we don't necessarily track it in that exact same way, but applications that would come in for things related to exposure, so respiratory problems, cancers, things of that nature, would be significantly smaller than mental health.
I'm just thinking about a process where a veteran comes in, makes a claim for exposure, then there's a list of all the sites where he's been, then the computer can crunch the numbers and get a some sort of relationship between that, because does the onus lie on the former service member to come forward and say, oh, I heard there was some contaminated substances at site XYZ, or is there a list of soldiers and members that had worked at one of these sites, and we reach out to them?
It's quite an interesting and detailed question, and I'd like to hear the answer, but he's way past time. I'm sorry. Maybe there's some other way to work that back in. I'm going to have to go to Madame Lambropoulos.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Harris and co. for being here with us today to answer some of our questions. When I first got elected in 2017, I was on the Veterans Affairs Committee, and I remember at the time it was a pretty, there were a lot of challenges in terms of the benefits getting out to veterans. So there were accessibility issues, lack of knowledge of how to access services. And one of the main issues I remember was the fact that it was very difficult for Veterans Affairs to be able to get access to medical records or any other kind of records from the CAF related to the service of the veteran. I'm wondering if that has changed at all since then, and how much more accessible is it now than it was back then, if at all?
Thank you. So that is the process of the application process. And so a veteran will submit a claim for a particular condition with perhaps some medical supporting documentation. We will verify their service record to confirm, whether or not they experienced, if we are taking the example of a physical injury, an accident where they would have hurt their shoulder, or a specific accident where they may have hurt something, or whether there is what would be considered repetitive exposure to something. So if you think of somebody who jumps out of an airplane regularly, they're probably going to have problems with their knees ultimately based on the impact that they suffer from repeated exposure to those kinds of things. And so that's the kind of thing we might be looking for in their service record. To get back perhaps to the earlier question as well, because I think there's a chance to kind of work in a bit of an answer to that one here. Yes, we would see in a veteran's service record whether or not they were in an area which had some exposure or contaminants that have been identified. And so as part of the medical records, as the Canadian Armed Forces and DND officials testified earlier, there may be things on their file already that indicate that there was an exposure at a particular site, either that they were at for a short period of time or a long period of time. That could be a factor in looking at what their condition might be. In terms of us being able to access information from the Canadian Armed Forces with respect to service records, it is much better. We are much faster. We had files beyond our service standard, which is 16 weeks, of about 22,500 in 2020. We're down to just about 6,000, so a reduction of about 72% over the last number of years, making decisions for veterans much more quickly. And that's thanks to be able to getting information from the Canadian Armed Forces on services much more quickly as well.
Okay, thank you very much. That's good to hear. Now, you mentioned in your opening statement that medical conditions caused by service or any kind of illness or condition they may have that they feel was caused by their service, they can come and ask for benefits for. I guess that's through the application process that you would determine if it is in fact caused by their service. Like, how do you go about making that kind of a decision? That's the question.
Sure, and for that question, I might just ask Mr. McDougall if he'd weigh in on that one quickly.
Sure, thank you for the question. So, as Mr. Harris mentioned, veterans can apply for benefits for anything that they feel is related to their service as part of that application process. They state to the best of their ability how they feel the service caused that condition. The first step in the process is that Veterans Affairs verifies with a medical professional that they have a diagnosed medical condition. That's an important step. Secondly, then we have Veterans Affairs trained adjudicators, often nurses, that review the service records to validate that something happened during service, such as an exposure or there was an injury or an illness that is the cause of their current medical condition. Those nurses have access to available research housed by the department from partners, other nations. They also have access to trained physicians, specifically trained physicians that evaluate the research and help them with advice if they so need it. The nurse, the trained adjudicator, ultimately renders their decision based on the evidence on the file and the best available science of the day.
Okay, thank you. And do you have like I know this is it's a bit odd to ask, but a percentage of cases that actually end up in receiving the benefits? Because clearly if they're showing up with a condition that they believe has been caused by their service, to some degree they know better than anyone whether or not that would be the case. Do you have any stats on when that gets when those decisions rendered are in the favor of the veteran?
I do. Last year,
No, go ahead, Sean.
Last year, 77, so the 23-24 fiscal year, 77% of our first applications were approved.
Okay, thank you very much. And I guess that's you kind of went over like the process used to assess the physical and mental needs of a veteran. I'm wondering if you can, you spoke about the fact that through their documents and through any files that they have, you can see whether or not there were toxic substances that were on the grounds that they were training on or anything like that. Has it ever happened where they didn't necessarily know of that at the time and so it wasn't recorded, and yet people are coming back with a condition that they think may be connected to something during their service?
Mr. Chair, that does happen, where exposure could be only identified after. Excuse me. Where exposure could only be, in terms of a contaminant being in a particular area, is only identified after. Somebody can come back, even if there's a decision that there isn't enough evidence to support a particular approval in that case. There are appeals processes as well, and there are an ability for somebody to come back with new information when they may have it, if more information on exposure is brought up, or contaminants in an area, or new research comes forward.
Ambropoulos, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît. Madame Normandine.
6 minutes, Ms. Normandin. Thank you. Thank you to the witnesses for coming. I will piggyback on the question raised by Ms. Lampropoulos. When we're talking about timelines, I'd like to know, are there any delays that lead to the fact that a file isn't looked at? And also, once we discover what the illness is, when we know that there's been exposure, and when you have to intervene, and when you have to determine the level of toxicity, and you look at the causality between the exposure and the illness, what's the starting point there?
Merci beaucoup pour
Thank you for your question. I think that it depends on the case. They may have had a disease or an injury related to service during their service. When we find out that, for example, that people that were exposed to contaminants during their service, sometimes there's an immediate impact, but sometimes there are individuals that can realize when they have an impact that surfaces 5 to 10 years later. So as soon as they describe themselves as being ill, as having a disease or a problem linked to their service, they can report the matter to AVAC for a decision. So they send the request to us. It takes about 16 weeks before they get an answer from VAC. We had problems meeting this timeline, but in the past, but we've improved things a great deal. And right now we're talking about 10 weeks before getting a decision. For certain conditions, quicker time, quicker, it's resolved quicker. My question talks about how much time does it take for a person, or is there a timeline? There's no limit. They can come to us 10 years later, for 30 years later. So if there's discovered that there were contaminants in a certain geographical area, they can come back to VAC at any time, at any point. Along the same line, can a file be reopened when they're told initially that it's not related to a professional injury, but we find out later on that there was a contaminant, chemical contamination? Can the file be reopened with the information that you had initially? It's not the same information because we would have had new developments, we would have had new research, new discoveries made. So it's not exactly the same information. It can also be, the file can be reassessed. A person can have some type of illness that has an impact of 10 or 5%, but perhaps the impact was just measured at being 10%, but the illness worsens and it might have a greater impact on them. So they can come back to us at that point and ask that their file be reevaluated, given that they are not doing as well health-wise. Thank you very much. Something that was studied at the VAC committee is reproductive health. I'd like to hear what you have to say about this. Let's say a veteran who had reproductive problems during their service, but the problems aren't only identified later on because of the service, but the impact was actually, the problem occurred during the service. Do you see this happening? Have you done any studies on reproductive health? And is it Veterans Affairs that's responsible for compensation, or would it be the Department of National Defense because the problem occurred during the service? If there is a negative impact during service, people can come back to us, particularly if something that was identified during service. The CAF will look after that. But if there's a long-term health impact on the veteran, they can come to VAC and request either compensation or ask for other support programs at any time. Same thing. If the people that have the problem identified later on, they turn to Veterans Affairs. And it's true, this is something that we're studying currently, along with other countries as well, and with the CAF that are doing stuff. There was a huge study done on veterans. We've just got the government response to the study, and there's a lot of things that we need to do in terms of research. I'll come back later with further questions on that. Thank you very much.
Madame Masson, 6 minutes.
I appreciate you coming before the committee today. I'm a little concerned, and I'd like to clarify a bit. We just heard from DND officials that stated that they have a good list. They're very good at documenting all the workplace hazards. They have that list. I think you said that you have that list in hand in terms of identifying the claims that people are putting forward. But you also said that you don't link the site contaminations or causes when you're looking at benefits to provide. You only base it on like you say, oh, they have cancer, we'll treat that cancer. I feel that a bit of a disconnect, because I had also asked, if there was a proactive role for DND to play in terms of making it easier when veterans are coming forward to pre-identify where they've been working. So could you sort of fill in the gaps around that, because it's a little I'd love clarification.
Thanks again for the question. I think the clarification that I'd offer on this is that the way in which the disability benefits program works is we don't compensate for the actual exposure itself. So we don't compensate for burn pits or the fact that you worked at a contaminated site. We compensate for the illness that developed as a result of that. And so the distinction is what's recognized in the disability benefits program isn't that you worked at a site that was contaminated. It's that as a result of working at a site that was contaminated, you have respiratory problems, you have nerve problems, you have a particular cancer, and that's the issue. We do have access to the information that Canadian Armed Forces references earlier, and that all forms part of what would be the decision-making process to be able to link those things.
Wouldn't it make it easier for those veterans who then have to prove all of these things and have to go through all that? Wouldn't it make it easier, faster, if you already had a pre-approved list, as you say, for these sites and for these contaminants to make it a faster process for veterans who are at this point suffering?
I think the answer to that one is that we don't have a presumptive model of decision making. And so as the Brigadier General testified earlier, it's not because you were exposed to something that you necessarily develop something. And so what we don't have is a system by which it's assumed or presumed that you get something from either the actual activity that you've been under, and that could be a physical injury, or that could be a mental health injury, or that could be certainly something that develops as a result of exposure. There does have to be something that links it from the service perspective. And I understand the question is if there was contaminants at a particular site, and if somebody was there and they have cancer, isn't that the link that needs to be done? And it's not a presumptive model from that point of view, but it is part of the information and evidence that's used in decision making. The veteran themselves doesn't have to actually prove necessarily that they were at Site X, given that it is identified in either Canadian Armed Forces information or perhaps even in their service record that they were in a site that was exposed for chemicals of some site, or they worked in a trade that had them exposed, as I think as Mr. Hammerschmidt explained in the first hour. They worked in, working with vehicles, and they are always using the same kinds of chemical products on a regular basis, day to day, that could expose them. These are all things that are factors that are in the decision-making process, but they aren't necessarily straight links either.
The very extensive study that the Committee for Veterans Affairs did had about 42 recommendations. One of them was recommendation 17 to develop a site registry for chemicals that people are exposed to. Could you talk about the implementation of that recommendation within your department?
So my department would be dependent on the Canadian Forces for developing those site lists. Yep, and in the response, it was a Canadian Armed Forces lead who responded to it, and so they're in the midst of, they have some of that information already, as was testified to here earlier, and it's about making it comprehensive so that that Veterans Affairs can also use that information to be able to render decisions on as I've sort of just described. So there's more work to do on it,
yeah.
Absolutely.
So because they asked for that, this was a significant part. It made it to a recommendation. Wouldn't that say that maybe that list wasn't as comprehensive as was previously mentioned? That asking for it now would suggest that the list that you had talked about before wasn't as comprehensive as it needed to be?
Mr. Chair, I would say that they're always in the midst of updating the sites and the experiences and the exposures that might have taken place as a result. I know there was a question in the first hour that referenced, do we go back and look at sites from before where the chemicals that were used may have new links to potential conditions and cancers, or that were looked at differently when they were sites and they were closed at a particular era and need to be looked at again. And I think that's part of the thing of keeping it as a living list of something that can be updated. I don't think it'll ever be entirely comprehensive and definitive, because it can always be revisited to add things that may have, after research, developed into different kinds of potential exposures as well.
The Americans are actually pretty far ahead of us in terms of identifying occupational illness and toxic exposures. They have proactive registries around burn pits, Agent Orange, other toxic exposures. They've passed the PACT Act that expands VA benefits for veterans who've experienced those exposures. has there been conversations within Veterans Affairs Canada on how to better our processes to show more of that proactive work being done? How can we expedite that process to be more proactive, like maybe the Americans are?
I might just ask Mr. Swenson to answer that one quickly in terms of the work that we do with our American partners and others on this issue.
Sure. The PACT Act that was introduced in August 2022 had two components to it. It was a huge expansion in terms of both healthcare and benefit eligibility. So the healthcare part, if we kind of separate those two, provided access to U.S. Veterans Affairs Health Administration services and care to those veterans. And in our public healthcare system, that's already provided to veterans. The benefit expansion that it provided added 20 presumptive conditions for burn pits and Agent Orange and other toxic exposures. And it also ensured, and this is important, that veterans had access to toxic exposure screening, that every veteran enrolled in VA healthcare had screening available to them every 5 years.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave the answer there way past time. Mr. Tulmy, 6 minutes.
Thought you were being generous.
It's not yet Christmas.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Mr. Harris, for joining us today. I think I'd like to start off by saying I know that we've been talking about cancer quite a bit. I think that it should be on record that cancer is not the only condition that is, been linked with hazardous toxic materials, and that there are neurological disorders that should be recognized, and I think we should be remembering that because there are others that are suffering. And so I am going to kind of piggyback on some of the questions and comments that have been made. One of the comments that you made, Mr. Harris, was in your opening testimony and one of your answers was that veterans, we know the process, they apply, they say, I've got a condition. And then you said, well, it comes to us and we sift through it and we go through with our professionals. And then you come back with either approved or denied. And so a veteran that's denied knows that they've been exposed to something. How do they prove? When they know that they've been exposed, how do they come back to you and say, I know I've been through this. I know I've been exposed to this. How do they convince you to change your mind to approve them of their benefits?
I would start by saying a couple of things. One is, as I've indicated, we will work from certainly a veteran's attestation of the experience that they've had. That's one element. So if a veteran indicates that they've been exposed to something, either in a very specific incident over a prolonged period of time, that's taken into consideration. And as we've been discussing, aligned with available both research, available evidence that could be used from Canadian Armed Forces exposure sites, contamination sites, things of those nature. If they come to us, they're also going to come to us with a medical diagnosis. So their doctor will also write up a diagnosis to say that person, Veteran X, has this. And that, while they don't necessarily assign what the cause is, they can speak to what's the likely course of the cause of something. And then we can look at it from the medical point of view as well. Cancers are very difficult. Neurological issues are very difficult, and I appreciate you highlighting that as another potential outcome of exposure, because it's important that we respect the fact that there are a number of things that could come from exposure, and that's another element of that. And so we'll take that all into consideration. We'll look at the research, the diagnosis, all of the available information, and render a decision. If a decision is not favorable in this case, veterans have access to a very strong appeals process through the Bureau of Pension Advocates, which is housed within Veterans Affairs. They have entitlement to have a lawyer represent them for a quasi-judicial hearing at a Veterans Review and Appeal Board. And the lawyer will help them gather evidence as well.
Thank you.
To do that.
Thank you, Mr. Harrison, and I think that's important for us to have that on the record. What about civilian employees? Do they still have the same access to that process?
So Veterans Affairs does not support civilian employees. Veterans Affairs do not support civilian employees of DND or elsewhere. We only support veterans and members of the RCMP for whom we also do disability adjudication.
Okay. I'd like to share my time with Mr. Stewart if he wanted to finish up on that question that he had earlier on.
Yeah. Thank you. We were speaking earlier about one was the onus being on the service member to come forward, or whether they will be contacted, and if there's, a record and trends of different exposures creating different illnesses amongst members that have been at different sites. And can you comment on that, please?
So the record of exposure, I think that's being referred to here, this is done and would be done through the Canadian Armed Forces National Defense Department in terms of reaching out and contacting people who maybe have been in an affected area. Veterans Affairs does not proactively reach out to the veteran community on potential exposures or identification as potential exposures. We do reach out from a communications point of view, writ large, to encourage people to come forward. If they feel as though they have an illness or an injury related to their service, we encourage them regularly to come forward. That could be certainly related to exposure, could be related to many, many other things. And I would suggest that the vast increase in the number of applications that we've seen indicates that veterans both are aware that they can come forward and apply at any period in time and are actually going ahead and doing so.
Ms. Lapointe, 5 minutes.
Thank you. And I will let the panel decide who is best to answer the questions I'll be asking. Can you provide an overview of how Veteran Affairs Canada assesses the extent to which a Canadian Armed Forces members may have been exposed to chemical hazards during their service? And are there specific sites or types of deployments that are of particular concern to Veteran Affairs?
Mr. McDougall, I might ask you to weigh in on that one, please.
Certainly. Thank you for the question. So I think, as we mentioned, exposure is complicated. I heard what the Brigadier General said from the CAF in the first hour that I think she talked about cigarette smoke, that exposure to secondhand smoke is different than smoking for 25 years. And we're always striving to, number one, increase our knowledge, increase our scientific evidence base. We have, within Veterans Affairs, as I mentioned, a team of physicians who work to establish what are called, internally, we call them entitlement eligibility guidelines for a whole host of conditions. But specifically on exposures, we have a document or a database, if you will, of the information that the CAF has in their records around exposure sites where certain chemicals may have been used. We also have information from, as included in that, from partners, other countries where they may be, a little bit more, I guess what I would say is where we've collaborated, where we've had joint missions, joint operations. Perhaps it was an American lead and we supported, and they have information. So we have that at our disposal. But I think the other important piece that we have is research on causality and effect of exposure, because it's really important to distinguish, on the one hand, that we need to understand that an exposure happened, but we also have to understand the effect of the exposure. And so that research could come from many, many different sources. It could be, I know we work with academia in Canada. We rely on the work of other partners as well, Five Eyes countries. But that research, that information is ever evolving and ever improving. And I think that's the point, is we've set up a process or a framework internally in the department to continually learn, continually grow in our understanding, so that as the knowledge, the research evolves, that we'll be more responsive and able to provide veterans with the benefits they're entitled to.
Okay, thank you. So in your response, I'm going to take it that there are ongoing studies and data collection initiatives that track veterans over their health care over time. So can you tell me what mechanisms are in place to monitor those long-term health care outcomes for veterans who may have been exposed to hazardous chemicals?
And maybe Mr. Swenson can weigh in on some of the research underway now.
Sure. Well, I'll start by just outlining that in order to conduct a longitudinal study like that, you need three segments of information. One, you need information about the time of exposure and their medical state, the medical state of an individual at the time of an exposure. And then you need information about their health outcomes at the end of the day. And then we need the scientific evidence around that shows how their individual experience compares against other large-scale studies. And this is a challenge, I have to say, in the Canadian context, because their healthcare records are maintained by the armed forces when they're serving, and their health records are maintained in a different jurisdiction entirely after they release by the provincial authority in which they live. And we as a federal government don't, due to privacy laws, we don't automatically have access to their full healthcare record from the province. We can ask for information from the individual, and we can ask for information when the individual comes to us from National Defense. But in terms of doing a large-scale study, we can't proactively go out and get current health outcome information from people in the general public, which includes all veterans. So we can do it on an individual basis for adjudication purposes when they come to us and they provide us information about their own health situation. The exception is with the help of Statistics Canada, who maintains a growing set of databases around health outcomes for the general population. We cannot see individual results in the databases that are held by Health Canada, but we can do aggregate studies.
Okay.
And so the cancer incidence study that we're conducting now
We're
is an
unfortunately,
example of that.
unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there.
Okay, thank you.
2.5 minutes, Madame Normandine.
Merci beaucoup. Je vais continuer.
Thank you. I would like to continue along regarding the question on reproductive health. I know this is a huge issue for veterans. Let's suppose that the damage is inflicted during this service. For example, a woman, so she suffers damage when she's younger, and once she's been discharged or released, she realizes that she was exposed to a toxic chemical. Is it the Department of National Defense that is responsible for compensating, or would it be VAC, given that the damage is not done once a person's been discharged? It's the health of the member that's impacted. So that if that case, it would be VAC. The application can be made to VAC. For either compensation or some type of support, for at least for the termination. So even if the damage was suffered during the service. Thank you. I have a question that's a little bit hypothetical. We talk a lot about cancer cases and the treatment that's going to be provided by Quebec and the other provinces. Has an evaluation been done on the amounts that provinces have had to pay to compensate, to pay out in compensation for problems that were caused by the CAF? To my knowledge, a study has not been conducted on that particular issue, but I do know that the Department of Veteran Affairs spends a lot of money to support these individuals. So most of the payments are linked to the people who have an occupational injury linked to their service. We're partners with the provinces for certain initiatives, for example, mental health, occupational stress injuries. So it's the payments made by the federal government, but it's a province that delivers the service. Thank you.
Madison, 2.5 minutes.
So for CAF members, military families, D&D employees who have been exposed or have problems because of the contamination that they're exposed to, sometimes the Government of Canada has actually repeatedly, the Government of Canada has used ex gratia payments to settle the claims related to the lack of protection that the government has provided those workers. An example of that, the government made ex gratia payments to some victims of Agent Orange in New Brunswick. I'm wondering how often that happens. If you could provide me with that information that's administered through Veterans Affairs, and why the government decides to base the compensation on the idea of financial liability.
I'm not sure I can answer all of the impacts or elements of that particular question. With respect to Agent Orange, I know that it was 2007. The Government of Canada introduced a one-time tax-free ex gratia payment that was issued or resulted in 5,000 payments being made to eligible individuals. With respect to Canadian Armed Forces members and or RCMP, the impacts of illness on their service are adjudicated through Veterans Affairs programming, so disability programming, pain and suffering compensation, or the Pension for Life and Wellbeing Act for veterans. The Pension Act remains in place for members of the RCMP. Veterans Affairs does not adjudicate anything with respect to employees, civilian employees of either RCMP or Canadian Armed Forces D&D. That would be a separate process, and so any ex gratia payments that would take place from that point of view, I would not be able to comment on at all. But I do know the number with respect to Agent Orange.
And you'll be able to provide that to the committee?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. But why does the government decide? Like, what's the process of the government to decide that they're going to make those payments in that way to limit liability in that format?
Mr. Chair, unfortunately, I'm not in a position to answer the decision making for the Government of Canada on the ex gratia payments. I'm not familiar with what that process has been, honestly.
Okay, so you can provide.
I could provide some. Pardon me, Mr. Chair. I could provide certainly some general documents around ex gratia payments and how they're used. That's something that we could provide back to the committee.
A Department of Justice decision as to whether it's ex gratia or pursuant to a liability or a recognized liability. But whatever you can provide, that's good. Ms. Gallant, 5 minutes, please.
Okay. Back to PFAS. Compared to the civilian population, are the incidents for CAF members exposed to PFAS higher or the same for infertility rates, pregnancy-induced hypertension, preeclampsia, increases in cholesterol, lower immunity, testicular cancer, kidney cancer, fetal child development, liver damage, increased thyroid disease?
Unfortunately, Mr. Chair, we wouldn't be able to provide any specific numbers around PFAS exposure with respect to Veterans Affairs and Veterans Affairs clients. As I noted, what we do have is people who apply for conditions, medical conditions, and the cause of it isn't necessarily tracked in the same way, and so we wouldn't have statistics that would be available on that.
Study to compare the Canadian Armed Forces firefighters to the general population as to whether or not there's a higher incidence. Okay. Have there been any reports of anthrax to VAC, either by serving members or former members?
To my knowledge, I'm not aware of any applications that have come forward related to anthrax from the veteran population.
When I was first elected, I remember a line of maybe 6 or 7 people sitting all across in the gallery, and one lady always had a white kerchief on her head. And, you know, I saw them sitting there for years. And then lo and behold, a few months ago, they were sitting in this committee. And I understand that they were from the Gulf War and had suffered Gulf War syndrome. And at a period during that time, they thought it was from depleted uranium. But that had subsequently been put by the wayside. But back to depleted uranium. So we know that we no longer use those shells in Canada, but there would have been some fired in practice ranges. And what would have happened to the shells, wherever they were shot for practice purposes? How would they been disposed of, or were they just bulldozed over?
Mr. Chair, unfortunately, that would be beyond my scope of knowledge as to how CAF or Canadian Armed Forces National Defence would have disposed of equipment that they were using, whether that be artillery, any other kinds of equipment that they might have. Not something that we would see.
Okay. And have you had any incidents of exposure to depleted uranium in the Canadian Armed Forces?
I don't think so. I'm going to say that's not something that I've seen as something that's come through as a causal condition or any kind of links from a Veterans Affairs point of view. I won't promise to be categorical about it. It is possible that amongst the applications we received, there's something. As I noted, what we are really looking at is someone's applying for a condition, and so their condition may be exposure to something, the condition's not exposure, condition may be cancer or something related from a disease point of view, but the condition that they're submitting it under is maybe not exposure to depleted uranium. We may not see it in that context.
Tracing back to where it may have been contracted. Okay. So what about mesothelioma, exposure to the asbestos? Do you see a number of claims or a greater number of claims amongst mechanics and or people who work in destruction of buildings or exposure to it? And if so, how are those places where the asbestos has been taken out, how are those sites being located and ameliorated?
So I can't speak to how those sites are being located and ameliorated. That would be the colleagues that appeared here before. With respect to people who've worked in those kinds of occupations, we do work to try and identify exposures that may be likely or experiences that may be likely by certain trades. And so, there was exposure to various chemicals and asbestos in things like Navy ships. And we're aware of that from a submarine point of view or from a Navy ship point of view that may have taken place 10 years ago or 50 years ago. And that would factor into the decision-making for somebody who's made an application for a certain condition. And so they would say, I was serving on a ship that was in the news around some exposure or some chemical leaks that occurred on those ships. And that would be a factor as part of the decision-making. We wouldn't trace the full story of it. We would just trace the individual linkage from a service-related point of view.
Ms. LaPointe, 5 minutes.
Thank you. So earlier, I was asking questions about how we support members who may have suffered occupational health risks or illnesses. Does Veteran Affairs Canada have anything in place to support the family members, so support the supporters?
So there are several programs in place that help support those individuals who support injured or ill family members. So, for example, we have a caregiver recognition benefit, which is an annual allowance of, I think it's about $1,200. It's been increased indexed by inflation over the course of the time since it started, but $1,200 a month to recognize the additional work and support that family members may offer to an injured or ill veteran. We offer some opportunities for family members if a veteran is not able to take part in some rehabilitation programs because they're too ill to. A family member, a spouse in this case, can take on the rehabilitation to be able to be trained to do something different that they may not be able to have done as a result of caregiving and other things if their own career was interrupted. There are some career transition supports that are available for family members, spouses in particular. Again, we talk about a veteran who might release at a certain base and be transferred to another, or maybe transferred during their career, and the spouse comes along with them and needs some help and support in finding a position in the new area to which they've relocated. And so there's some supports that exist there. And there's availability of some counseling sessions independent of the veteran. If needed for family members, there's a VAC assistance service that's a 24/7 service where people can get up to 20 counseling sessions through mental health provision supported to them when there's issues that may arise as a result of being in a military family. And a family, last one I'll just mention quickly is a veteran family program. It's available through the Military Family Resource Centers that I'm sure have come up at this committee a number of times, whereby releasing members can go and their family members can go and get supports from the local Military Family Resource Center as well to help with their transition.
Here, thank you for that. How does Veteran Affairs Canada ensure that veterans are informed about a potential chemical exposure that they may have experienced during their service? And is there a communication protocol in place? And another question is, do you offer proactive health screening?
Thanks for the question. We don't do proactive healthcare screening. We're not a frontline service provision organization, so we're not a healthcare entity. The distinction between some of the questions that have come forward from the Veterans Administration in the U.S., they actually provide healthcare. They have hospitals. They have a full network of supports in place across the country because they do not have nationalized healthcare. And so as a result of that, they've set up a whole network of it. And so that's a bit different than what we do. We help provide for veterans to be able to access benefits and service that are provided by individuals in provincial settings across the country. We help support them to get eligibility for it. We help to fund their ability to participate in treatment and rehabilitation, but we don't do that frontline service provision from that way. It's a distinction, and so we do not offer healthcare screening from that perspective. It would be the healthcare system to allow to do that.
Ensuring that veterans are informed.
Yeah, and so we do a lot of things to reach out to veterans. When it comes to things like exposures and mass exposures, typically that would be the Canadian Armed Forces and National Defence if there's something that happens with a Canadian site in particular. When we're talking about exposures in overseas sites, again, Canadian Armed Forces may certainly communicate that information out. Veterans Affairs doesn't specifically send out information related to potential exposure sites necessarily, but we reinforce by retweeting, recommunicating, posting on social media, things of that nature as well. We're not necessarily the first ones to do it. We'll certainly broadly share that amongst our veteran community as much as possible.
And how closely does Veteran Affairs Canada work with the Department of National Defence to ensure that veterans that have been affected by chemical exposures receive timely support?
We work on a daily basis with the Canadian Armed Forces, and so from a structure point of view, I know Madame Lalonde chairs CMAS Canada across the country, working with provincial representatives and things like Veterans Affairs Canada to try and make sure that there's no gaps either between the healthcare that veterans receive while they're in the military or ultimately when they release out of the military. I'm co-chair with the Chief Military Personnel at Canadian Armed Forces, a joint steering committee between Veterans Affairs and the Canadian Armed Forces that meets regularly, not only at a very high level, but on a working level to make sure that there's issues that are identified and shared and rectified as quickly as possible. And so from a transition point of view, from a healthcare point of view, from a research point of view, we're regularly meeting with our Canadian Armed Forces colleagues to ensure that we're sharing information and working together on those issues.
It's going to bring to a close our time with you, Mr. Harris, Mr. McDougall, and Mr. Svensson. I want, on behalf of the committee, thank you for your attendance here. It's quite a good contribution to our study, so thank you. Colleagues, before we adjourn, it's our intention to do contaminated sites again Thursday, and then the following week today, December the 10th. I want to just raise a flag, and if you could give some indication to me over the next day or so. The threat environment is changing quite dramatically in the last few weeks, and particularly with the drawdown of Russian and Iranian resources in Aleppo, and the increased involvement of the United States in providing equipment to Ukraine. I was just wondering whether there was an appetite for us to arrange a updated threat assessment, shall we say, before we break for Christmas. Cheryl.
Okay, would that threat assessment be restricted to a certain area, or could we hear on everything from Taiwan, even though it's not a Canadian threat, it could end up involving our troops?
I was thinking in terms of CRINCs. CRINCs, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea.
Nothing on Ukraine. But
Well,
that's Russia.
that's
yeah,
Russia.
Yeah, okay.
So is there an appetite to do that? Okay. So we'll do that. You're welcome to go, Mr. Harris, by the way. Second thing, when the Library of Parliament published a report on Tuesday, the 24th, there was an error made. It probably happens once every 3 centuries, but there has been a subsequent report that you received in your P9 account correcting that mathematical error. Martin is quite able or willing to speak to it if you wish to speak to it, but noticing that it's 10 after 6, and I would encourage you to talk to him directly if you think this is a big issue, but I, as chair, don't think it's a big issue, but just for the purposes of the record, I think you should take note that Martin was quick to point out the error and quick to tell us what the error was, and we appreciate the superb support we get from our analysts. So, anything else, Mr. Clerk?
Yes, sir.
Can we go home?
Yes.
Okay. Meeting adjourned.